Think living in a castle meant silk robes, royal feasts, and a cushy life behind stone walls. Think again. For most, castle life wasn't glory, it was guts, grime, and gut-wrenching labor. From scrubbing waste in pitch-black tunnels to cleaning up after nobles who never used a toilet. These jobs weren't just dirty, they were dangerous, humiliating, and at times fatal. Welcome to the reality of castle service, where survival often meant doing the unthinkable. In the bowels of a medieval castle, far beneath the stone corridors and grand halls, lived a stench that never truly went away. This was the realm of the gong farmer, one of the most reviled and dangerous occupations in the castle system. The name gong came from the Old English gang, meaning to go, a euphemism for human waste. And the gong farmer's task was simple in theory but brutal in reality: to remove the accumulated excrement from the castle's cesspits and latrines. Castle sanitation in the Middle Ages relied on a system of garderobes, vertical shafts built into the castle walls that directed waste into a pit or moat below. These shafts might seem crude by modern standards, but for the time they represented engineering foresight. Still, they required someone to maintain them, especially when the waste built up to dangerous levels. That someone was the gong farmer, working by torchlight or primitive oil lamps. The gong farmer would descend into the pit, shovel in hand, and dig through layers of decomposing human waste. This wasn't just unpleasant, it was hazardous. Methane and ammonia levels in the cesspits could become so concentrated that a single open flame could trigger an explosion. Many died by asphyxiation, others by drowning in the very substance they were sent to remove. The job came with strict hours. Gong farmers were only allowed to work at night, often between 9 p.m. and 5 a.m., partly to keep them out of public view and partly because of the unbearable stench. In cities like London, which had thousands of cesspits and privies, entire teams of gong farmers worked in coordinated shifts, hauling waste in barrels or carts to dumping grounds outside the city walls. Despite the risks and the filth, the job paid relatively well. In the late 14th century, some gong farmers in England earned up to sixpence a day, far more than many other labourers. But the social cost was steep. Gong farmers were often shunned, barred from taverns, and forced to live on the outskirts of town. They were essential to public health, yet treated as pariahs. Records from York and London describe how cesspits would sometimes collapse under the weight of centuries of waste, swallowing workers whole. In 1326, a man named Richard the Raker purportedly died when the ground beneath him gave way and he drowned in a pit of excrement. Though some details of the story are debated, the danger was real. Poor structural support, limited air circulation, and the sheer volume of waste turned every shift into a life-threatening ordeal. The work was gruesome, the smell permanent, the danger constant. Yet without gong farmers, castles and cities alike would have collapsed under their own waste. They lived in filth so others didn't have to. Their work, though hidden in the shadows, was the foundation of medieval sanitation. In the kitchens of a medieval castle, where fires blazed from stone, hearths and iron spits turned day and night, one of the most punishing jobs fell to the smallest and weakest. The turnspit, often a child, was tasked with a role as relentless as it was invisible. To keep the meat turning, the mechanism itself was simple. A large wooden wheel, mounted horizontally and connected by rope and pulley to a spit over the fire, acted like a primitive treadmill. The child would step inside and walk for hours, causing the wheel to rotate and the roast to turn. This ensured that the meat cooked evenly and didn't burn. In castles that hosted frequent feasts, this was a job that demanded constant attention, sometimes lasting from before sunrise until the last course of supper. Turnspit children were usually poor, sometimes orphans, often taken in under the guise of charity. Others were bonded servants, sold into servitude by desperate families. Their small size made them ideal for fitting inside the cramped wheel structure, but this also meant they lacked the strength to endure the physical toll. Heat stroke, exhaustion, and blisters were only the beginning. Positioned just feet from roaring fires, they faced constant dehydration and burns from stray embers or contact with hot iron. In the wealthiest kitchens, such as those at Hampton Court Palace under Henry VIII, multiple turnspits worked in shifts. But in smaller castles or manorial estates, one child might bear the load alone. Records from 16th century England describe how children collapsed from heat or lost their footing inside the wheel, breaking bones or suffering severe injuries. There are accounts of children being beaten for stopping too early, especially if it ruined the meat for a noble feast. Despite the cruelty, turnspits were often overlooked in household accounts. They appear rarely in records and were considered expendable. In some rare cases, particularly in later centuries, dogs were trained to replace them, known as turnspit dogs, but the practice of using children persisted well into the 17th century in parts of Britain and continental Europe. The Job's dangers weren't just physical. Turnspit children worked in isolation, cut off from fresh air and natural light, developing deformities in posture and muscle from years of constant strain. Their contact with nobility was non-existent. They existed in the margins to the functioning of the great household, but completely disposable. The turnspit's wheel was eventually replaced by mechanical, clockwork rotisseries during the Industrial Revolution. But for centuries, in nearly every castle and manor that roasted meat over fire, it was a child who kept the feast turning, sweating, burning, and walking endlessly in place. In the medieval castle kitchen, hierarchy was rigid, and at the very bottom stood the scullery maid, often a young peasant girl. She was tasked with the filthiest, most physically punishing duties in the culinary chain. Her place was not near the table or even the ovens, it was beside the cauldrons, the drains, and the ash pits. Scullery maids began work before dawn, long before the cook arrived. Their first job was to light the fires that would heat the water and the hearth. From there, the day dissolved into a routine of endless scrubbing. Large iron pots, blackened from open flame and coated with hardened animal fat, had to be scoured. Using sand, ash, and raw muscle, soap was a rare luxury. Fingernails tore against rough surfaces. Hot grease splattered from pans not yet cooled. They worked near cauldrons filled with boiling water or broth. A misstep could result in severe burns, and on slick stone floors constantly covered in water, grease, and kitchen refuse, slips were common. There are recorded cases, especially in larger households, of scullery workers being permanently maimed or scalded in accidents. Medical treatment was basic at best. Infections spread easily, especially when open wounds were exposed daily to grime and hot water. In wealthier castles like Chateau de Vincennes or Westminster Palace, the kitchen complex could stretch across multiple chambers, with the tucked away in a back corner, poorly ventilated and dimly lit. In these spaces, heat and smoke gathered with nowhere to go. The air stung the eyes, and breathing became difficult over long shifts. Beyond the physical demands, the social status of a scullery maid was near rock bottom. She was often unseen by the nobility and barely acknowledged by the higher-ranking kitchen staff. Her work was essential without her. Nothing in the kitchen could function, but recognition was non-existent. Meals for hundreds depended on her, but she ate only after everyone else, often surviving on scraps. Scullery maids were expected to clean chamber pots as well, particularly if no dedicated servant handled waste removal. In some castles, they were required to maintain the wooden trenchers and bowls used by lower status servants, scraping them clean and drying them by firelight before the next meal. Despite their role, records rarely mention individual scullery. Maids most entered service in early adolescence, and many left only through marriage, injury, or death. In the 14th century, during outbreaks of plague or famine, scullery ranks thinned, not just from disease, but from girls fleeing the unbearable. Work conditions. The position was a reminder of the brutal labor system beneath medieval grandeur. For every royal feast celebrated in a great hall, there were hours of sweat and injury endured behind the scenes, often by the youngest and most voiceless in the castle. In medieval Europe, medicine operated on a theory of balance, the belief that the human body was governed by four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness was seen not as the result of pathogens, but of imbalance. And to correct that imbalance, physicians turned to bloodletting. One of the most common tools for the job was the leech. But before the leech could be placed on a noble's temple or a monk's arm, someone had to find it. That task fell to the leech collector. Leeches, particularly Hirudo medicinalis, thrived in shallow, muddy marshes, ponds, and slow-moving streams. The collector's job required wading into these murky banks, often barefoot or with their legs bare, to attract the leeches directly. The process was simple and brutal. Allow the leeches to attach. Wait for them to fill with blood, then pry them off and drop them into clay pots or animal bladders for transport. Collectors were usually women, often poor peasants or widows. The role existed across much of Europe, but became especially common in England and France during the 12th through 15th centuries, when leeching became institutionalized in monastic infirmaries and university-trained medicine. At peak demand, a single monastery could require hundreds of leeches per month. The work was painful and dangerous. Leeches could remain attached for 20 to 40 minutes, extracting several tablespoons of blood each. When done repeatedly, over hours, the blood loss became significant. Wounds often became infected, especially in the swamp-like environments where collectors worked. Cases of septicemia, chronic anemia, and parasitic infections were common. Many suffered long-term damage to their legs or immune systems. There are surviving records of collectors dying from the cumulative effects of exposure and blood loss, though their deaths were rarely documented beyond local accounts. In places like the fens of East Anglia or the marshlands near Paris, collectors worked in isolation. The job was not regulated, and there was no protection. During harsh winters, leeches disappeared, and collectors went hungry. During plagues, demand for bloodletting surged, and with it, the risk of disease from handling already infected blood. By the late Middle Ages, the leech trade became commercialized. Apothecaries and traveling merchants bought leeches in bulk, shipping them in wet moss to cities and universities. Collectors, however, rarely saw more than a few coins. Their role was invisible in the chain of medieval medicine, yet their contribution fed the most widely accepted treatment of the era. For centuries, the leech collector bled so others could be bled. In an age when healing was often more dangerous than the illness itself, They stood at the muddy threshold between nature and medicine, risking their health to serve a belief system they didn't create and would never benefit from. Among the most peculiar offices in royal households of late medieval and Tudor England was that of the groom of the stool. The title alone drew curiosity, but its function was as literal as it sounded. This man, often of noble birth, was responsible for attending the monarch during defecation, assisting with undressing, cleaning, and ensuring the royal bowels functioned with comfort and regularity. The position first emerged during the reign of Henry VII in the late 15th century and reached its full significance under Henry VIII. The stool in question was a portable commode, padded and enclosed for privacy. It accompanied the king wherever he went: castles, hunting lodges, and even military campaigns. The groom's duty was not simply to clean. He was also to observe, record, and report on the monarch's digestion, as bodily health was tied to notions of divine right and national stability. Despite the nature of the work, this was not a job for a commoner. The groom of the stool was chosen from among the monarch's closest courtiers. Edward VI's groom was Sir Michael Stanhope. Henry VIII had several, including Sir William Compton and Sir Anthony Dennyman, who later held key political influence. The position granted intimate access to the king, both literally and politically. Many grooms acted as informal advisors, passed messages, and influenced appointments. Their proximity to the monarch during moments of vulnerability bred trust unmatched by other roles at court. But this access came at a cost. The role invited ridicule, particularly from foreign ambassadors and rival courtiers. It blurred the line between service and humiliation. Satirists mocked it, and pamphlets from the Elizabethan and Stuart periods often referenced the role as symbolic of the absurdity of court hierarchy. Under Henry VIII, the groom of the stool had administrative responsibilities as well. He managed the king's private chambers, kept financial accounts, and even handled sensitive documents. The position evolved into a mix of valet, secretary, and body attendant. During a time when royal privacy was nearly non-existent, the groom became one of the few who saw the monarch in unguarded, unfiltered moments. That access translated into influence, not always visible, but consistently powerful. By the 17th century, the role began to shift. Under James I and Charles I, it became more ceremonial. The rise of the Privy Council and modern bureaucracy reduced the groom's political sway, and by the 18th century, the job faded into royal pageantry, losing its original function. The title is easy to mock, but for over 2 centuries, the groom of the stool stood as a strange paradox of court life, fat once degrading and powerful, hidden in shadow yet close to the throne. In a world where loyalty was tested and intimacy with the monarch was currency, no one stood closer than the man with the towel. Rats were drawn to castles for the same reasons people were: food, shelter, and warmth. Grain in storerooms, scraps in kitchens, bedding in stables, straw in dungeons. Every part of a large household fed an expanding rodent population. When infestations got out of hand, a rat catcher was called in. His tools were basic: a club or hooked stick, a cloth or leather sack, sometimes smoke pots, traps baited with grain, or small dogs trained to lunge at movement in the dark. Castle kitchens were prime hunting ground: spilled barley near the bakehouse, offcuts from butchery, dripping fat under roasting stations, perfect feeding lines. In written household ordinances from late medieval English and French estates, stewards warned kitchen staff to remove waste quickly, or vermin would foul stores and chew through salted meat casks. The rat catcher worked after meals, when the rooms quieted and animals crept out. He might block exits, beat on barrels, and drive rats toward traps or dogs. Gloves were rare. Rat bites infected easily.graнаries posed another hazard. Climbing ladders into lofts thick with chaff, catchers sometimes sank into loose grain, risking suffocation. Rodent droppings ruined seed stores, and in siege conditions that loss could mean hunger for the entire garrison. Nobles paid when scarcity threatened. Otherwise, the work was seasonal and poorly compensated. No one in the 14th century understood Yersinia pestis, or the fleet or rat-to-human chain that modern science later documented, but people noticed patterns. After the Black Death reached Europe in 1347 and tore through England in 1348–49, chroniclers from Florence to London linked foul air, filth, and swarming vermin with sickness. Civic and manorial rules that followed clearing refuse pits, restricting animal slaughter inside walls, repairing grain bins were practical anti-rat measures even if the biology was unknown. Rat catchers found themselves busier in plague years as panic drove lords to purge storage areas. Stables and cellars were the last circuits of the job. Grain-fed warhorses dropped feed. Wet hay, rotted rats tunneled through flooring. In castle dungeons, warmth from occupied cells and the steady drip of waste sustained colonies that spread upward through wall gaps. Catchers crawled into these spaces with torches, risking smoke inhalation and flea exposure. Many worked barefoot or in thin shoes that did nothing against bites. They were rarely named in accounts, often lumped under varlets of the house, or paid by the rat tail. Yet every healthy store of grain, every plague-fearful lord trying to keep disease at bay, depended on the dirty night work of the castle rat catcher. In an age before germ theory, he fought an enemy no one fully understood, lost often when the torches were extinguished and the castle fell into silence. The night watchman remained awake. His duty was simple in concept: patrol the outer walls, check the gates, monitor the grounds, and sound the alarm if anything was amiss. But in practice, it was one of the loneliest and most perilous roles in the medieval structure of defense. Castles were built with defense in mind, and nighttime was when they were most vulnerable. Enemies preferred to strike under cover of darkness. Fires started easier, sentries were drowsy, and noise traveled slowly. The watchman's eyes and ears were the castle's only defense once the drawbridge was raised and the inner doors barred. Most castles, whether in England, France, or the Holy Roman Empire, maintained a rotating night watch by the 13th century. Men worked in shifts, but even short patrols were grueling. The battlements were cold, windswept, and exposed. During winter, frost bit through cloth and leather. In rain, footing turned treacherous. In silence, every creak or rustle could signal danger raw, nothing at all. The role demanded alertness, but offered little stimulation. Watchmen were forbidden to sleep, and were often punished harshly if caught dozing. In 1283, the Welsh garrison at Carnarvon Castle reported a breach during a night watchman's absence, prompting a royal order to double patrols. Failure was not just a personal risk, it endangered the entire garrison and inhabitants. Beyond physical threats, there was the psychological toll. Medieval society was steeped in superstition. Night was associated with evil spirits, demons, and omens. Supernatural fears were not abstract beliefs. They shaped how people moved through the world. The moaning wind over stone turrets, the howl of wolves in the distance, or unexplained noises inside shadowed courtyards became part of the Job's burden. There are accounts of watchmen abandoning posts after hearing what they believed were ghostly cries near execution sites or graveyards, just beyond the castle walls. Some castles imposed ritual checks to ensure reliability. In London, during the reign of Edward III, constables conducted surprise inspections, and fines were issued for missing or late patrols. In larger strongholds, such as Chateau Gap. In Normandy, signal systems using horns or bells were established, with night watchmen expected to respond at intervals to prove they were conscious and moving. Weapons were basic: a short sword, a lantern if oil was available, and sometimes a horn. If intruders were detected, the goal was not to engage, but to sound the alarm. Yet ambushes did occur. Bandits, deserters, or enemy scouts often struck the outer walls, looking for vulnerabilities. Watchmen were the first to face the manned, sometimes the first to die, though rarely honored or even mentioned in chronicles. The night watchman stood as the castle's final line between security and siege. While nobles dreamed in warmth behind heavy doors, someone else paced in silence, exposed to the cold, the dark, and the fear that comes with knowing what might be waiting just beyond the gate. Medieval castles were feats of engineering, built from stone blocks weighing hundreds or even thousands of pounds. But before the walls could rise, before towers pierced the sky, someone had to lift those stones. Without pulleys powered by steam or hydraulics, that task fell to human beings, men, locked inside massive wooden wheels called treadmill cranes. These cranes appeared in Europe by the 12th century and became widespread during the great building campaigns of the 13th and 14th centuries. Cathedrals like Notre Dame de Paris and castles such as Château de Coucy relied on them. Each crane was a giant vertical drum, often over 8 feet wide. A man or sometimes talked inside, like a hamster in a wheel, turning it with their body weight. The rotation pulled a rope wound around an axle, lifting stones suspended from the other end. At ground level, the work looked impressive, but inside the wheel it was lethal. There were no safety rails, no modern brakes. One slip, one misstep, and the worker could fall forward into the moving machinery. Injuries were common: crushed feet, broken ribs. In worse cases, the entire structure failed, sending stone blocks crashing to the ground, sometimes with workers attached to the ropes. Construction records from the Tower of London and the rebuilding of Windsor Castle under Edward III mention cranemen or wheelmen, often hired seasonally and paid by the load. Their wages were slightly higher than common labourers, not because the job required skill, but because it was considered too dangerous for most. Many were itinerant workers who moved from site to site, following where stone was laid and scaffolds rose. These men worked under overseers, masters of works, who managed supply chains of timber, lime, lead, and masonry. But the treadmill worker had little say in the process. He labored in silence, often above ground, high over courtyards, where wind and rain added more hazard. During winter, frozen wood became slippery. In summer, the wheel's interior became stifling. Inside the drum, visibility was limited. Communication with workers on the ground relied on shouted instructions, prone to mishearing or delay. Many treadmill cranes were mounted on temporary wooden towers built alongside the rising structure. As the walls grew higher, the crane was dismantled and reassembled at the next level. This constant reconstruction added further risk. Accidents often occurred during these transitions. Despite the danger, this method remained in use for centuries. Even in the 15th century, during the late Gothic period, treadmill cranes powered castle keeps, bridges, and bell towers. They were effective, cheap, and brutally efficient. No draft animals could replicate their control or reach. But they required men willing to climb into a machine that could maim or kill with a single misstep. The strength behind medieval stone wasn't just in the architecture, it was in the muscle and sacrifice of men turning wheels no one ever saw. They worked above the heads of kings and builders, suspended between sky and stone, where a moment's error could end everything. When plague swept through a town, most people locked their doors and prayed. A few walked toward the dead. These were the plague buriers, men tasked with clearing the bodies no one else would touch. They moved among the dying and the rotting, sometimes in silence, sometimes through streets echoing with cries for mercy. Their job was as necessary as it was lethal. The Black Death struck Europe in 1347. By the following year, it had ravaged England, reaching cities like London, York, and Bristol with devastating speed. Contemporary estimates suggest that by 1351, up to 1/3 of Europe's population had perished. Death came quickly. High fevers, blackened swellings in the groin and armpits, vomiting of blood. Entire families died in days. Municipal systems collapsed. Churches overflowed. There was no time for ceremony. In this collapse, plague buriers became a crude form of frontline response. Most were conscripted from the poor men with no other means of survival. Some were criminals offered reduced sentences in exchange for service. Others were parish laborers, appointed by town councils under emergency ordinances. In cities like Florence and Avignon, mass graves called plague pits were dug outside the walls. In London, the most infamous lay at East Smithfield, where hundreds were buried daily between 1348 and 1350. The work required no skill, only the ability to endure. Corpses were hauled by cart, often stacked 10 or 20 at a time. Buriers worked quickly, sometimes without gloves, sometimes without shrouds. The dead were handled with ropes or crude hooks. The smell of decomposition, especially in warm months, was overwhelming. Protective clothing was minimal to non-existent. The beaked plague doctor mask, though iconic, was rarely worn by buriers. Most wrapped cloth around their faces, soaked in vinegar or herbs. In a desperate attempt to avoid infection, few succeeded. The mortality rate among plague buriers was exceptionally high. Chroniclers, like Giovanni Boccaccio, noted how some workers died in the middle of their route, collapsing onto the very carts they pushed. Others vanished either from infection or fleeing their post. To manage the shortage, town records from Siena, Lubeck, and Marseille show emergency wage increases and forced labor policies. Payment was often made in coin, food, or shelter, but no amount guaranteed survival. The role came with no honor. Buriers were reviled, feared, and sometimes attacked for supposedly spreading the disease. They worked at night or in isolated corners of town. Priests were too overwhelmed to provide rites. Funeral bells stopped ringing. Still, their work kept cities from total collapse. Without them, corpses would have rotted in the open, contaminating water and drawing vermin. In Paris, municipal accounts from 1349 showed that officials prioritized corpse removal over nearly every other service, even fire brigades. The plague burier disappeared from records when outbreaks ended, often without name or grave. They served in the shadow of catastrophe, surrounded by death, with no guarantee of survival. In an era when fear ruled the streets, They were the ones who carried the weight literally of a dying world. Beneath the stone floors of many medieval castles, past the courtyards and beyond the great halls, sat the dungeon, damp, dark, and built not for reform but for silence. In these shadowed chambers, the dungeon keeper held one of the most feared and psychologically punishing roles in the entire castle system. His job began with confinement. Dungeons, particularly in 12th to 15th century Europe, were often built into the lowest levels of a castle tower underground, windowless, and lined with stone or packed earth. Some were simple holding cells. Others were oubliettes, steep vertical shafts, accessible only from a hatch above, where prisoners were dropped and forgotten. The keeper controlled access. He held the keys, managed chains, and was responsible for food, water, and waste removal, though in practice, most prisoners received the bare minimum. Daily work was monotonous and foul. Excrement collected in corners. Ventilation was poor or non-existent. Diseases like dysentery and typhus spread quickly. Rats, drawn by rotting straw and human remains, were constant. The keeper waded through this every day, often alone, with no barrier between him and the madness of those imprisoned. But confinement wasn't always the limit of the job. In times of political unrest, rebellion, or religious inquisition, the dungeon keeper's role extended into torture. In England under Edward I, or in France during the reign of Philip IV, prisoners accused of heresy, treason, or conspiracy were often subjected to techniques meant to extract confessions, regardless of truth. The keeper did not design the questions, came from above, but he prepared the space and tools: racks, manacles, thumbscrews, and heated irons. While some castles employed specialized torturers, in many smaller or provincial fortresses, the keeper himself performed the task. The records from Château de Loches in France, or the Tower of London, contain descriptions of jailers tasked with both guarding and punishing the same individuals. Surviving reports detailed dislocations, forced starvation, and prolonged shackling. Payment varied but was rarely substantial. In some cases, dungeon keepers were allowed to demand bribes from prisoners' families for better treatment, creating a system of extortion layered over cruelty. The psychological cost was immense. Chroniclers and legal records show repeated complaints of jailers turning unstable. Some developed what modern psychologists would recognize as trauma responses. Others grew desensitized, were worse, began to enjoy their control. By the 14th century, abuses by dungeon staff were common enough that legal reforms emerged. In 1305, Edward I's government issued orders limiting torture and required greater oversight of London's prisons. Similar mandates appeared across Europe, often ignored. Morality was rarely considered. The keeper worked on the edge of legality, sanctioned by the crown or nobility, but vilified by the common people. He saw prisoners starve, beg, rot, and scream. He saw the wrongly accused and the truly violent alike. And when his shift ended, he returned to quarters often only steps away from the cells. The dungeon keeper's name rarely made it into official chronicles, but his role, silent, brutal, and buried beneath the stones, was essential to the machinery of medieval justice. He was the hand that turned the key, the eye in the darkness, the enforcer of pain behind the mask of order. Medieval castles often evoke images of grandeur, banners fluttering over towers, armored knights dining in candlelit halls, the echoes of minstrels in stone corridors. But that image, preserved in storybooks and screenplays, obscures the truth. For most who lived or worked within castle walls, life was anything but noble. The real engine behind the medieval stronghold wasn't the king or the knight, it was the unnamed, the unseen, the expendable. The scullery maid ankle-deep in greasy water, the rat-catcher digging through refuse in pitch-black storerooms, the gong farmer navigating cesspits waist-deep in human waste, the night watchman alone on the ramparts, scanning a black horizon in silence. Their labor, silent and brutal, held the system together. A castle's walls may have been built from limestone or granite, but its survival depended on muscle, sweat, and a kind of resilience history rarely honors. The builder in the treadmill crane, turning wheels until his legs gave out. The leech collector, letting parasites feast on her blood so a nobleman could undergo treatment. The dungeon keeper, locked in a moral twilight between duty and decay. None of it resembled romance. The feasts, the pageants, the chivalry all rested on the backs of those who rarely had names recorded. They endured frostbite, disease, burns, injury, and early death, while others debated matters of lineage or land. Their world wasn't about glory, it was about surviving another shift, another season, another winter behind stone walls that promised protection but offered little comfort. Castles stood, not just because of military strategy or royal decree, but because thousands gave their lives in service to the structure itself. Forgotten servants, broken bodies, silenced screams. They formed the unseen foundation of medieval power, one that crumbled the moment their labor ceased. Behind every turret and banner there was a shadow, and in that shadow history worked without glory.